I was around 10, and the year was around the year 2000. It was Thanksgiving, and my birthday is November 23rd. This is the date for Thanksgiving, like once every 4 years. I can't recall if the day in question was one of my birthdays or not, but it's not really that important. So, I live in South Mississippi, and for holidays, sometimes we go see our extended family one town over. They have a big house, lots of land, live out in the woods, and have smaller buildings around the main house, which were being used as storage mainly. When we arrived, my parents introduced me to the cousin of mine that I had never met, named Zach. He was 1 year older than me, making him about 11 at the time, I think. We hit it off instantly too, and we went upstairs to play Mario Kart on the SNES. After an hour of that, we took to running around outside for a little bit, which led to us exploring the smaller buildings on the property. We came across one that could have been an apartment for someone, and it had a small kitchen, a refrigerator, TV, a living area, and some workout machines on the first floor, and it wasn't a big building at all. The upstairs consisted of 2 empty bedrooms and a very small hallway dividing them. The upstairs rooms were to the immediate left and right at the top of the stairs as well. So, me and Zach went up there, and we found an empty room to the right, but the door on the left was closed. We went back to the first floor and fired up the TV so that we could be away from all the adults for a while and just hang out. One of my uncles even came in to grab some frozen food from the freezer and told us to have fun and be safe. The usual adult platitudes. Roughly half an hour goes by when, out of nowhere, we heard a loud crash, and it sounded like a car crash if I'm being honest, or maybe something akin to a loud metal object falling through a house. And it all seemed to be coming from upstairs. Naturally, we wondered what the hell was going on. Me going first, went to the staircase to see what was up, and there he is. A neon green figure, similar to how the Flying Dutchman from SpongeBob is depicted. Transparent and bright green, was just staring over the railing at us. It was hanging halfway out of the previously locked door, just staring at us, and the door was cracked open now. His torso stopped at the door. Me and Zach both screamed bloody murder and ran back to the main house and told her parents, who laughed it off as kids being kids. I think someone even made the statement that it could be a deceased cousin of ours that stayed over there at one point or something like that. To this day, my mother even brings it up sometimes because we both love the paranormal stuff. But it being so long ago, I'm pretty sure that my memories have at least distorted it a little bit. That image of the green man sticking through a door and leering at me down a staircase, and that loud crash will be with me forever. So guys, if you have any similar stories, I sure would love to hear them. I usually just lurk here, but I've heard a few stories in my time that kind of line up with my own, so if you have any explanations as to what this could be, I would really love to hear it. For reference, I'm a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago when I was 17. I had just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I'd never had a boyfriend before, I'd never even been on a date in fact, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university or anything, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. But one late night, I was in my room just working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me, so intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call this boy Ken. We got to chatting though, and I asked him how he got my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much of it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk though, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I guessed, our roots were in fact the same country. Let's call it the motherland. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself in his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow too, he convinced me and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was actually a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal in fact. Our MSN chats carried on for a couple of weeks. They developed into text messages, and we even had a few phone calls after I agreed to give him my phone number. I started to develop a crush on Ken, and he'd asked me to go out with him a couple of times, but I was always pretty busy with school, and our schedules just weren't lining up. But finally, we found one afternoon where we were both free and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and had actually offered to pick me up from a university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C+ programming class that day, but just right for the lunch date that we had planned at a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with Mum because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18 with someone who randomly added me on MSN. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows pulled up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down and, sure enough, there was Ken, sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, what I wasn't expecting was the intense smell of weed floating out of the car. It's not really that relevant, but it was definitely part of the first impression that I got. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback by this and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he immediately put his hand on my thigh. I sort of nervously shifted my leg away, and I said, "So, do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything and just started driving. Okay, kind of weird. I thought maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, but then I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus and there was really no reason for us to be getting on the highway. "Hey, you don't need to take the highway. The restaurant's really close by. I can guide you." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I began to hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke, for the first time since I got into the car. "I thought maybe we could just go to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed and I can make lunch for you." Now, I was 17, on my way to the house of a guy that I'd just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing because I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do. Despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date though by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play NFS together, which I told him that I liked playing. Don't judge me. So, like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house though. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside and, of course, nobody was home except for us. It was sparsely furnished and looked really unkempt, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me, though, that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the driveway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted the empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in his room, too, so I just sort of cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. And then I started to actually relax a bit as we played NFS, and he made us some PB&Js to munch on and whatnot. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something really strange. He got up onto the bed and sort of sat down directly behind me, his legs on either side of me, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid up under my shirt. That was when I really started to panic. I thought that he was going to try and grope my chest, but instead he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15 and then some, so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk at me and tell me that he liked it. I, though, felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked where I lived so he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense not to tell him, and I asked him to drop me back at school instead, where I would be supposedly meeting my classmates, and he obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, though, I decided that I really didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or on my phone or anything, our only two methods of communication, but I just rarely responded to his messages and I ignored most of his calls. On one occasion, though, he messaged me on MSN around 11 PM, asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, though, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to do that?" He replied, saying, "No sex, I promise." It was just bizarre, to say the least. I was disgusted, and he didn't even respond again. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months, and then all of a sudden just sort of vanished. I figured that he must have finally got the point. I really do wish that the story ended here, but it doesn't. So I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on a holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call Anne, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Anne, whom I love dearly, was and still sort of is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with Motherland, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. And while we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent spiritual trip to Motherland, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend of hers. Let's call her Connie. Now, during our visit, Anne actually introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in the Motherland. We chatted with her a couple of times throughout our vacation via Skype and got to know her a little bit. But little did we know back then that Connie, who Anne had spontaneously met halfway across the world in the Motherland, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not, and may never be, ready to tell because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. But what you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and a con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Anne had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence, in other words. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security that we had ever had as well. When we finally caught on and confronted her, though, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. And I know, you're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with my story about Ken. Well, get this. So, the situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. But while she normally resided in Motherland, Anne had invited her to visit and stay with us where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things really took a turn for the worse too. Some of the things I clearly remember and are important to the story were that, 1, the whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school and program in the US. I don't even live in the US, and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she had asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself from my husband. Really weird and sort of disturbing stuff, I know. During this time, though, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think about anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went pretty much unnoticed. Fast forward to another day, though, after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number that I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever the name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped into my stomach. My phone displayed a name, and the first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I immediately started to panic, and I ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect, and when I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought that I was going to puke when I came to a sudden realization that he had been a part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have any hard evidence to prove that he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. So the timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life, the last name, a fairly unique surname, originating from the part of the motherland where Connie is from, and I'd actually never known Ken's last name up until this point. Plus the fact that he had contacted me out of the blue and I had no idea why or how, and it was just all way too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called, and I told him that he could never call me again, or I would call the police. And his response was just sort of weird. Dry, sort of half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then," in the most creepy voice that you can think of, and just hung up. I knew in my gut that this was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, though, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I was having a conversation with my family member, who was also closely involved in all of this, about the whole ordeal, and she told me that she sensed something extremely wrong when Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US to that obscure school. She said that she just had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of a human trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would probably never see me again. And I think that the horrifying pieces really came together for me at that moment. And up until that point, I was just way too naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken had told me, no sex, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. But I strongly and firmly believe that Ken had been some sort of a player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may be wondering, we never actually called the police on Connie or Ken because nothing illegal had technically happened, at face value anyway. It's very hard to explain, but I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after this, and I don't know why, I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out or something, but I was not able to find even a sliver of information on him, not by the name of Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID too. It was honestly as if he just didn't even exist anymore. Also, I am awful at directions and didn't remember his address or where his house was exactly, so I couldn't really use that either. And I'm sorry if this story is a bit convoluted or confusing. I'm trying to get my point across without giving any names or too many details, which makes it a little bit challenging. I do hope, though, that this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone, to do your checks on people, and especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and wary of people's intentions. Also, from this incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations anymore. To be honest though, I never really liked the idea of them to begin with, but nowadays, I've truly experienced just how they can attract both vulnerable people and also some really unsavory characters who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are into that sort of thing or anything, but it's just definitely not for me. But anyway, I would like to hear what you guys think about all of this. Do you think my suspicions are plausible, or what do you make of this? Please do stay safe, everyone. I'm a guy, mid-20s, living in the US. This happened a few months back, and I'd like to share it. So about a year ago, I decided to quit my corporate job of several years. Long story short, I was absolutely miserable, and I needed a serious change. So I dipped into my savings, packed up only my most necessary belongings, and I moved from my hometown on the East Coast to XYZ City, some 2,000 miles away. An impulsive decision for sure, but one that I don't regret. My first month, I sputtered through a series of odd jobs, casually drifting from one gig to another as I tried to figure out what I really wanted out of my life. Eventually, an acquaintance suggested that I try bartending. At the time, I had no experience at all, but I thought, you know what, screw it. Why not put myself out there? Couldn't hurt to try, right? I applied to all the LGBT bars in town. I'm gay. I figured that a job at one of these places would be a good way to integrate myself into the community, and maybe even meet some guys without having to resort to Grindr and the like. I quickly hit it off with the owner of a neighborhood pub, and he hired me on the spot, promising to mentor me in all things booze-related. And the following months were some of the best of my life. Met a lot of good people, and I gained a lot of perspective. I'm now even starting grad school, but I still work at the same bar a couple of nights a week. And that's where the following incident occurred a few months ago. I should mention that this bar is on the corner of a main road and a quiet side street, but that's important to know. Around 5:45 p.m, I parked my car halfway down the side street, which at that time was lined with cars, and I walked back to the pub. After taking some deep breaths and doing some quick mental prep, despite the nature of my job, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool introvert. I walked through the front door, tossed my car keys into my knapsack, and tossed my knapsack over the main bar. It's my routine, and what I always do. Only bartenders are ever allowed behind the bar, and I've never really felt the need to lock my personal belongings in the back office. It's just not that kind of place. What I mean is, almost all of the patrons are quality people, hard workers, community members, younger, older, everything in between. People who generally deserve a break every now and then, if only in the form of a cocktail or three. That being said, it's definitely not Cheers, and admittedly this job has really made me wise to what so many women must have to endure on a regular basis. Not everyone is respectful of personal boundaries, especially when you're new or fresh meat. I've been leered at, I've had guys reach out and run their hands through my hair, stroke my chest, squeeze, well, things, forcefully pull me closer and whisper to me all things that they'd like to do, only to get righteous and angry when I don't enthusiastically reciprocate. My first week, my boss told me, half-jokingly, that this is a gay bar, there's no such thing as sexual harassment. I guess because they're dudes and I'm dudes, we're all dudes, I'm supposed to just man up and deal with it. Which, for the most part, I do, or did. The money's consistently good, but I still can't say that I'm entirely comfortable with it. Double standards suck, right? Anyway, Monday evenings can be a bit of a hit or miss. That one Monday was a miss, for sure, but by the time 10 p.m. rolled around, only a couple of folks remained. And that was when Vern walked in. I'd guess that Vern was in his mid to late 30s, I'd say. Solid build, clean-shaven, average-looking, sort of impeccably anonymous. I'd never seen him before, but he sat down at the edge of the counter on the very last stall, next to where I enter and exit from behind the bar, and where I usually leave my belongings too. He ordered a soda and introduced himself, and we made small talk for a few minutes. He seemed to be a pretty affable guy, and nothing about him seemed explicitly out of the ordinary. But admittedly, something about him just didn't quite sit right with me. He almost seemed a little too ordinary, like conspicuously so. He was kind of dressed up as dressed down, if that makes any sense. It's hard to describe, but think along the lines of someone who might spend an hour trying to style perfect bedhead. Anyway, at some point, the topic got around to video games, which I love, and for a good 10 minutes we discussed some upcoming releases that we were both apparently excited about. Eventually, I had to excuse myself to help another customer, as well as finish a couple of other tasks that still needed doing. But Vern said that it was no big deal, and of course I needed to do my job. Cool, no problem. As I walked around the pub, cleaning this and that, I couldn't help but notice, though, that whenever I happened to look in Vern's direction, he was already looking at me. This is something that I've gotten used to as a bartender, I admit, but again, something in particular just didn't sit right. Sometimes he would look away, but most of the time he wouldn't, giving me a tiny impenetrable smile. This went on for a while, nearly 2 hours in fact. I'd walk up to him occasionally, ask him if he needed anything, and we'd have a brief exchange. I'd go back to my other duties, he'd just keep on staring, and so on and so on. In all that time too, he only ordered one more soda, and he didn't talk to anyone else. He had his smartphone on the counter in front of him, but I never once saw him looking at it. As I said before, I've experienced worse, definitely, so I figured that he was probably socially awkward, or maybe just lonely. But whatever he was, though, he wasn't particularly subtle. By midnight, Vern was the only person still sitting at the bar. There were 2 guys playing pool in the back room, out of sight, and a few guys smoking on the patio, but Vern and I were the only ones in the main room. In that sort of situation, too, it would feel rude to not chat up the only person left in the vicinity. It's part of my job to make people feel welcome, after all. But despite it being a super slow night, I felt drained, and I just couldn't find the energy to strike up a genuine conversation with someone who wasn't making me feel like I was on full display. But despite being a super slow night, I felt drained, and I just couldn't find the energy to strike up a genuine conversation with someone who was making me feel like I was on full display. I figured it would be a good time to just go to the storeroom and grab a few cases of beer that I had to restock soon anyway. So I excused myself, and I told Vern that I was going to the office and would be right back, but if he needed anything that he could holler. When I made it inside the office, I immediately felt a sense of relief, like I'd finally made it backstage after a gruelingly long performance. It took me about 30 seconds to grab the stuff that I needed, but I decided to sit down and just mess around on my phone for a few minutes, enjoying my solitude. I stayed there until it felt like I'd been away from my post for a bit too long, at which point I grabbed the beer cases and I headed back to the bar. To my surprise, though, Vern was gone by the time that I got back, and there was a $20 note under his glass. I felt suddenly guilty, not because I had just made money off of him, though of course that was appreciated, but because maybe he really was just some horny closeted dude who didn't know how to interact with other guys, and maybe the money was his only reliable way of expressing gratitude for the company. And maybe I had misread the cues and was projecting my own insecurities into his, admittedly, awkward behavior. Maybe, right? In any case, he was gone now, and I still had more to do, so I placed the cash in my tip jar and mentally thanked him for it. I began going about my tasks for the rest of the shift, and I quickly put Vern out of my head. A couple of hours later, around 1 a.m., I escorted the final stragglers outside and I closed the front door. I work alone on Monday nights, so it usually takes me a little less than an hour to finish my tasks after closing. And, as per usual, I put on some chill music and I went on autopilot. I finished everything around 2 a.m, I think. After turning off the last few lights, I also grabbed my knapsack, set the alarm, and headed for the front door, which locks on its own. I started to amble down the street towards my car, the only one left on the block. All I could think about was how badly I needed to pack a bowl and jump into the shower. When I reached the back door of my car, I absentmindedly yanked it open and threw my knapsack into the back seat, slamming the door closed. I stepped up to the driver's side door and pulled the handle, and I climbed inside. Only as my ass made contact with the seat and I reached my hand toward the open door, did I realize that I hadn't taken my car keys out of my bag. I never actually unlocked my car, and a wave just rolled over me like I jumped into an ocean and I saw something in the periphery of my vision. And I kid you not, there he was, just sitting there in my passenger seat. Now, I am not at all ashamed to admit that I screamed. The driver's side door was still wide open, but I didn't and couldn't move. I just stared at him, kind of dumbfounded. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," Vern said. I didn't immediately respond, so he quickly followed up with, "I thought that we could hang out, maybe play some games together." Then, like it was nothing, he handed me my car keys, which he had obviously stolen out of my bag during those minutes that I was in the office, and apologized again, presumably for having my keys in the first place. Then he offhandedly gave me an address and said that he didn't live far away if I was interested. I'd like to say that I was this close to grabbing him by the collar and beating the crap out of him, but something in my gut just urged me strongly to play along, to pretend like this situation wasn't completely insane. I mean, the street was deserted, I had no idea if he was armed, how unhinged he was, etc. There were just too many variables. "No worries, man. You just gave me a fright," I said casually, like he was an old childhood friend who had just flown into town to surprise me on my birthday. "I just wasn't expecting to see you." Quite honestly, I had no idea what to say. It might have been a stupid decision on my part, I know, and there were probably 1,001 things that I should have done instead, but I tried to genuinely meet him halfway and just be as gracious as possible, as calmly as possible. "Yeah, that sounds cool, but it was a crazy long night for me, and honestly, I'm just really tired. Can we rain check?" A few silent moments passed, but I suppose I sounded genuine enough because he crossed his arms and simply said, "Okay." I asked him if he had his car parked nearby, and he said no. I didn't press the issue further, and again, dumb, I know. I told him outright that I'd be happy to drop him off at his place, at which point we could trade numbers and make plans in the morning after I'd gotten some sleep. Somehow, appeasement seemed safer than flat-out confrontation or running away, or suggesting Uber or whatever. I didn't want to offend him or make him feel like he was in the wrong. I had no idea what he was capable of, whether he was actually malevolent or just an alien from another social dimension. In the end, he quietly agreed to the ride, and man, that was the longest 10 minutes of my life. On the way, I asked him about how his day went and what games he liked and other random stuff. I mentioned multiple times that I was really glad to meet another gamer and that it'd be fun to share the hobby with someone else. Basically, I said whatever it took to keep the conversation light and flowing, but he didn't seem to say much at all aside from occasionally directing me left and right, and whatever he did say had a sort of petulant tone to it. I honestly felt like I was driving home a psychotic toddler whom I just refused McDonald's. He looked out the passenger window the entire ride. Occasionally I would glance over at him, but mostly I tried to keep my eyes forward because I found that focusing on the road made me feel more centered. Of course, in hindsight, a part of me wishes now that I had acted more assertively, whipping around a sharp turn and sending him flying effortlessly out the window or something. You know, something badass, but being friendly and accommodating was really the only thing that seemed appropriate at the time. My grandfather always told me, kill him with kindness, and I disagree that that's always the correct solution, but it's what I did that night, and it seemed to work. I considered driving directly to a police station, but I wasn't terribly familiar with the neighborhood, and I didn't want to rile him up by taking out my phone. Before long, though, we arrived. The destination was a small park or something in a suburb that I'd only driven through a couple of times previously. He said that he would walk the rest of the way, and at his request, I brought the car to the stop on the corner. There was a short, somewhat terrifying too, lull before either of us said anything or made any sort of move. I offered to put my number in his phone, but he refused and simply said thanks and just got out of the car. As soon as he closed the door, I hightailed it down the street. I drove aimlessly for about a mile before I pulled over and just idled on the side of the main road. I sat in silence for a few moments, and then I called my boss, who at this point is a good friend. Honestly, I did not care that it was after 2 a.m. at this point. He picked up after a couple of rings, and I quickly regurgitated everything that had just happened. He was a good sport about it too, and didn't just play it off as laughs, instead expressing legitimate concern. But we had a mandatory staff meeting that week in which everyone was told that they needed to be on guard, and how the bar would be installing several cameras for extra security. And thankfully, but also somewhat eerily, I never saw Vern again since that night, and nor have any of the other bartenders.